Chapter 6: The 7 Lies of Learning. What are the most limiting myths you tell yourself? How can you overcome the debilitating effect of these myths? How can you turn these limiting beliefs into positive ones? You're being lied to, constantly, sometimes by yourself. We are all subject to an endless stream of misinformation about our constraints to our capabilities, and we receive this information so often that most of us have no other choice than to believe it. The problem is that these messages directly oppose your quest to become limitless. These limited ideas entertain lies in our mind can stall us or steer us in a direction we don't want. So, let's bring 7 to light, examine them for what they are, and replace them with something better. Lie number 1: intelligence is fixed. On the surface, it looked like Ray was a pretty positive person. She ran her own business, she had a thriving social network, and she loved being around people with big ideas who could imagine possibilities that most of us wouldn't dream of. When Ray had a daughter, she realized that perhaps she wasn't as positive as she thought she was. A different kind of mindset started to show up in very subtle ways, as these things do. First, it was in the way she reacted to some of the things her little girl did. Ray tended to think that that's just the way she is, instead of believing that she could have an effect on the way her daughter behaved. When her partner tried to teach their daughter new things, Ray noticed she felt a subtle discomfort, as if she wanted to protect her daughter from disappointment if she wasn't able to learn what she was being taught. She became aware of the constant thought that her daughter was too young to learn that. One day, her partner looked at her and said, "Do you think she can't learn? That she's never going to improve from where she is?" The answer was, of course not. She loved her daughter, and the little girl was bright and curious and learning something new every day. The opposite was obviously true, and yet Ray was aware that there was some belief buried deep inside her that whispered, "No, she is the way she is." Ray was struggling with a fixed mindset about her daughter's intelligence. These beliefs are incredibly subtle. Few of us consciously think about our restrictions or the restrictions we believe others have, but it leaks out in places that deeply affect our happiness, in our work, in our home life, and with our children. If we believe that it's not possible to improve, then in reality, it won't be possible to improve. It's extremely difficult to accomplish something when you don't believe it can be done in the first place. Carol Dweck, a professor of psychology at Stanford University, describes the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, students believe their basic abilities, their intelligence, their talents are just fixed traits. They have a certain amount, and that's that. And then their goal becomes to look smart all the time and never look dumb. In a growth mindset, students understand that their talents and abilities can be developed through effort, good teaching, and persistence. They don't necessarily think everyone's the same or anyone can be Einstein, but they believe everyone can get smarter if they work at it. Like Ray, most of us don't think about whether we have a fixed or growth mindset. Most of us have carried on thinking in the same patterns that our family did, without even knowing it. As subtle as this is, the adoption of one or the other deeply affects the way we approach life. With a fixed mindset, things are the way they are. We are powerless to change them. With the growth mindset, we have the ability to improve anything. If Ray thinks, even on a very subtle level, that her daughter can't improve or grow, What does she do instead of teaching her? Probably a number of things: placating, giving timeouts, diverting attention. All of those work to alleviate the stress of the moment, but they don't contribute to her child's growth. In the same way, if as adults we believe that we don't have the capacity to learn, what do we do instead of taking responsibility to teach ourselves what we want or need to know? We tell ourselves it isn't necessary. We make excuses. We blame other people or circumstances. And then we distract ourselves with the things that make us feel good. The genesis of this limiting belief is likely one that you either don't remember or that came from your early years. And it has a deep effect on the way you view intelligence and your capacity to learn. IQ scores and testing were created in the early 1900s to better assess which students would experience the most difficulty in school. French psychologist Alfred Binet and his student Theodore Simon were some of the first scientists to come up with a test that measured intelligence after they were commissioned to do so for the French government. They were able to devise a test that took into consideration age as it related to competency. They were also lauded for the fact that the test was easily adaptable to other languages and cultures. More than 100 years later, it's still hotly debated whether these tests have the ability to measure intelligence, which is the ability to acquire and assimilate knowledge and information. Interestingly, Binet himself was not happy with the way his test was used because it didn't measure creativity or emotional intelligence. Furthermore, our cultural understanding of these tests mean we give these scores undue weight. We tend to think of IQ scores as a fixed reflection of our intelligence, but that isn't the case. The IQ test actually measures current academic capabilities, not innate intelligence. To this day, IQ tests still don't measure creativity or practical intelligence, which you can think of as street smarts. And they certainly don't measure emotional intelligence, all three of which are increasingly more important in the workplace and in life. The important distinction here is to remember the difference between test scores and your ability to learn. Those who claim that IQ is fixed for life are in fact referring to our IQ test scores, which are relatively stable, not to our intelligence levels, which are constantly increasing, says Brian Roche of the National University of Ireland. David Shank refers to this idea in his book, The Genius in All of Us. He writes that everyone has the potential for genius, or at the very least, greatness. But the reason we prefer to believe that we're either a genius or we're not, or that we're either talented or not, is because it relieves us from the responsibility of taking control of our own life. A belief in inborn gifts and limits is much gentler on the psyche. The reason you aren't a great opera singer is because you can't be one. That's simply the way you are wired. Thinking of talent as innate makes our world more manageable, more comfortable. It relieves a person of the burden of expectation. Your intelligence is not only malleable, but dependent on your ability to cultivate a growth mindset. Start looking at your attitude. Listen to the way you talk. A fixed mindset usually shows up in your language. Maybe you say to yourself, "I'm not good at reading." This kind of statement implies that you believe this is a fixed situation and that your skills can't be improved. Instead, try something like, "This is something I'm not good at yet." This shift in language can be applied to anything you want to improve. Test scores do not determine your future. They don't determine what you're capable of learning and accomplishing. Take your education into your own hands. Here's the truth. It's not how smart you are, it's how are you smart. There are multiple types of intelligence, More on this later. Like so many things, intelligence is a combination of attitudes and actions and is dependent on context. New belief: intelligence is fluid. Lie number 2. We only use 10% of our brains. We've all heard this myth. Some of us heard it for the first time in a classroom. Some of us heard it from a friend. Some of us heard it through the media, maybe a documentary, a TV show, or a movie. This myth is usually used in the context of highlighting longed-for possibilities. If only we can access the rest of our brains, what could we accomplish? The story has been traced to a number of different sources, but as so often happens in the shifting of public opinion, it's likely built on successive events. Some attribute it to the author and philosopher William James, who wrote in The Energies of Men that we are making use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. It could have originated with the work of Pierre Flourens, a French physicist famous for his discoveries in the late 1800s about how the brain and the nervous system work and work together. The myth could also be related to the work of Dr. Carl Lashley in the 1920s, when Lashley removed parts of rats' cerebral cortex, an area responsible for higher-order cognitive processing. He found the rats could still relearn some tasks. This led him to hypothesize incorrectly that whole parts of the brain were not necessarily being used. Some blame the earliest neuroimages from PET and fMRI scans, which showed bright blotches on a screen with simplified explanations like, "This is what your brain does when you pick something up." These images typically showed just one portion of the brain lighting up, leading the layperson to conclude that we only use a small portion of our brains at one time. This assumption has also been perpetuated in countless ads and movies over the last 100 years. The adaptation of the book, The Dark Fields, which was produced as Limitless in 2011, says we use 20% of our brain function. The 2014 movie Lucy claimed we use 10% at any given time. In 2017, an episode of Black Mirror, a show known for its research and well-thought-through use of facts and statistics, touted the myth, saying, even on a good day, we only use 40% of our brain's capacity. All these storylines were focused on the idea of unlocking our greatest, albeit hidden, potential. Needless to say, this myth is pervasive, and yet it's not true. In a succinct NPR segment, the host plays a clip of Morgan Freeman posing in his dramatic bass voice the what-if scenario upon which Lucy is based. What if there was a way of accessing 100% of our brain? What might we be capable of? Neuroscientist David Eagleman gives a pointed response. We would be capable of exactly what we're doing now, which is to say, we do use 100% of our brain. Countless evidence backs this up, too much of it to include it all here. But Barry Bayerstein, a professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, describes some of the major scientific discoveries that refute this myth, which I've paraphrased here. Studies of damaged brains show that there is no single area of the brain that can sustain damage without a loss of ability, contrary to earlier theories. Brain scans have shown that all brain areas are active no matter what the activity. Even while we sleep, all parts of our brains show activity. Our brains are energy hogs. The brain takes up only 2% of space by weight and yet accounts for 20% of energy consumption, more than any other organ. We wouldn't need such an incredible amount of energy for an organ that functioned at 40% or less. Scientists have also determined that the brain's regions have distinct functions that work together. After extensively mapping the brain over decades, they've concluded that there are no functionless areas of the brain. Finally, as we've learned, the brain uses a process called synaptic pruning. If we didn't use a large portion of our brains, we wouldn't expect to see large areas of degeneration. We don't unless brain diseases are present. To sum up, this myth just isn't true. In an interview with Scientific America, neurologist Barry Gordon from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore said that the idea is so wrong it is almost laughable. Here's the truth. What I want you to take from this is that you have all the power of your brain available to you now. The utopia that each of these movies and TV shows depicts is already possible for you. While we use all our brain, some people use their brain better than others. Just as most people use 100% of their body, there are some bodies that are faster, stronger, more flexible, and more energized than others. The key is to learn how to use your brain as efficiently and effectively as you possibly can. And by the end of this book, you'll have the tools to do so. New belief. I am learning to use my whole brain in the best way possible. Lie number 3. Mistakes are failures. When we hear the name Einstein, we think of brilliance and intellectual feats, the likes of which most of us believe we'll never accomplish. The nearly synonymous relationship is well-deserved. Einstein did more to further the scientific field in general and physics in particular than any other scientist of our time. His discoveries have made possible some of the most important modern-day technology. With such an illustrious reputation, it would be easy to assume Einstein rarely made mistakes, but that is not the case. To begin with, his development was described as slow, and he was considered to be a below-average student. It was apparent from an early age that his way of thinking and learning was different than the rest of the students in his class. He liked working out the more complicated problems in math, for example, but wasn't very good at the easy problems. Later on in his career, Einstein made simple mathematical mistakes that appeared in some of his most important work. His numerous mistakes include 7 major gaffes on each version of his theory of relativity, mistakes in clock synchronization related to his experiments, and many mistakes in the math and physics calculations used to determine the viscosity of liquids. Was Einstein considered a failure because of his mistakes? Hardly. Most importantly, he didn't let his mistakes stop him. He kept experimenting and making contributions to his field. He is famously quoted as having said, "A person who never made a mistake never tried anything new." What's more, no one remembers him for his mistakes. We only remember him for his contributions. So why do we fear mistakes so much? It could be ingrained. As school children, we were judged on our mistakes, and the number of them on any given test determined whether we passed or failed. If we were called on in class and said the wrong answer, most of us were usually too embarrassed to raise our hands again. Unfortunately, mistakes are not often used as a tool for learning. They are used as a way of measuring one's capabilities. Make too many mistakes, and you fail your test or your class. We need to change that. Too many of us don't come close to our capacities because we are too afraid of making a mistake. Instead of looking at mistakes as proof of failure, take them as proof you are trying. One of our podcast guests, Beth Comstock, former vice chair of General Electric, and her team learned this when the company had to scrap a new line of products in which it had invested. Comstock, author of Imagine It Forward, Courage, Creativity, and the Power of Change, often speaks on the ever-growing demand on business and the people within them to adapt and change faster. She reflects on how she and her team were able to look at the mistakes they made not as a failure, but as major learning lessons that led to the development of a new line that moved the company forward. Instead of dwelling on the mistakes, they asked themselves what they learned. Here's the truth. Mistakes don't mean failure. Mistakes are a sign that you are trying something new. You might think you have to be perfect, but life is not about comparing yourself to anyone else. It's about measuring yourself compared to who you were yesterday. When you learn from your mistakes, they have the power to turn you into something better than you were before. Also, remember that you are not your mistakes. Making a mistake doesn't mean anything about you as a person. It's easy to jump to the conclusion that you are inherently worthless, but you make mistakes. Mistakes don't make you. Place them under your feet and use them as stepping stones to rise to the next level. It's not how we make mistakes, but how we deal with them that defines us. New belief. There is no such thing as failure, only failure to learn. Lie number 4. Knowledge is power. We've all heard the phrase knowledge is power, usually as a reason for learning, as if knowledge alone will give us power. You might have also heard this phrase used with the opposite intent, as a reason to withhold information or knowledge from another person, say, in a negotiation. Although the phrase knowledge is power is commonly attributed to Sir Francis Bacon, the first known use of the exact wording was not penned until Thomas Hobbes, who acted as secretary to Bacon in his younger years, used the phrase scientia potentias, Latin for knowledge is power, in Leviathan in 1651. He then expanded on the idea in De Corpore in 1655. Unfortunately, Hobbes' original sentiments had been cut short over the years. In the original, Hobbes said, "The end of knowledge is power, and the use of theorems is for the construction of problems, and lastly, the scope of all speculation is the performing of some action or thing to be done." Put another way, knowledge is important, but it is the performing of some action that is required to make it powerful. This is where we get stuck as a culture. As discussed, we're deluged with information on a daily basis. We have more access to knowledge than we ever had in the history of humankind. And yet, this glut of information makes it more and more difficult to act. I used to believe this myth. When I was the boy with the broken brain, I wanted nothing more than to be able to learn like the rest of the kids in my classroom. But once I was able to do that, I quickly realized that possession of knowledge wasn't going to differentiate me from the people around me. It was how I used my knowledge that would. Here's the truth. Knowledge is not power. It only has the potential to be power. You could read this book and learn everything in it, but if you don't take it and apply the knowledge, it will be useless. All the books, podcasts, seminars, online programs, and inspiring social media posts in the world won't work until you put your knowledge into action. It's easy to talk about what we learn, but I want to challenge you not to talk about it, but to show what you learned. It's better well done than well said. Don't promise, prove. Your results will speak for themselves. New belief. Knowledge times action equals power. Lie number 5. Learning new things is difficult. When we hear the word learning, we usually think of school. Few of us have fond memories of school. Even if we did well academically, school is typically a place associated with the growing pains of youth, where we felt romantic love for the first time and probably rejection, and where we experienced crushing boredom. For those of us who struggled in school, the added emotions of shame, doubt, and the ever-present feeling that we're too dumb to learn anything colors the word. It's no wonder that when we think of learning, we think of difficulty and strife. Carol Greeter is an American molecular biologist who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her part in discovering how telomeres change with age, which has an enormous potential for how we understand and treat cancer. Greeter has the distinction of being a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor and a Daniel Nathans Professor, and she is the Director of Molecular Biology and Genetics at Johns Hopkins University. With such an illustrious career, one would assume Greeter whizzed through school, but such was not the case. When I was in elementary school, I was considered a poor speller and somebody who couldn't sound out words, so I was taken into remedial classes, recalls Greeter. I remember having a tutor come down and take me out of class and bring me to a different room. It certainly felt like I wasn't as good as the other kids. It turns out she had dyslexia, a learning disability that affects parts of the brain that process language. Those who struggle with dyslexia have problems identifying speech sounds and relating them to letters and words, which results in difficulty reading and sometimes speaking. Greeter felt stupid and describes the situation as hard to overcome, but she didn't give up. I kept thinking of ways to compensate. I learned to memorize things very well because I couldn't spell words. So later, when I got to take classes like chemistry and anatomy, where I had to memorize things, it turned out I was very good at that. I never planned a career. I had these blinders on that got me through a lot of things that might have been obstacles. I just went forward. It's a skill that I had early on that must have been adaptive. Even though school was hard at first, she found other ways to make up for her disability. And because of her ability to adapt, she became the kind of problem solver who could not only learn, but could contribute to research that changed the way we view cancer. Learning was hard for her, but she figured out how to work around her disability. After all, it's not how smart you are, but how you are smart. Because Greeter had to problem solve her way through learning, she now has a career that is having an impact on the world. The truth is that learning won't always be easy, but the effort pays dividends. In fact, learning should be at least a little uncomfortable. Otherwise, you're mostly reinforcing what you already know. If you've ever tried to cut wood with a dull blade, you know that it takes far more time and energy to accomplish the task than it should. In much the same way, lacking motivation or having inadequate methods will slow you down and make you feel as if learning is too hard. And we'll show you how to address those issues later in this book. The key is taking small, simple steps. Think about a stone cutter. The stone cutter may sit there and hammer away at his block of stone for what feels like an eternity, making only small chips and dents here and there. But in one moment, the stone will crack open. Was it the one time that did it? No, it was all the sustained effort that prepared the stone to split. Approach your learning like a stone cutter. It will require you to cultivate patience, to have a positive attitude, and to be adaptive to your own needs. If you are the kind of learner who does best with books in your hands, that's fantastic. But if you already know that doesn't work for you, why keep trying the same thing? Look for other ways to learn that do work for you. Know that it won't be hard, but it will require effort, though perhaps not as much as you think. The key is consistency. You must have the patience to consistently come back at it again and again. When you do, you will not only reap the rewards of hard-earned knowledge, but you'll be a better person for having cultivated the tenacity to keep trying. Here's the truth. Sometimes it is hard to learn new things. What's more accurate is to understand that learning is a set of methods, a process that can certainly be easier when you learn how to learn. New belief. When you learn new ways how to learn, the challenge of learning new things can be fun, easier, and more enjoyable. Lie number 6. The criticism of other people matters. Years ago, I was a keynote speaker at an event hosted by Deepak Chopra. After my presentation, I sat down in the audience to watch the rest of the programming. To my surprise, a tall figure approached and loomed over me, and I looked up to see one of my favorite actors, Jim Carrey. What followed was a deep conversation in the lobby about creativity. At one point, he said, "Jim, I'm working on Dumb and Dumber 2, and I need to get really smart to be Dumb and Dumber." A few weeks later, we spent a day together at his home. During one of our breaks, while making guacamole, one of my favorite brain foods, in the kitchen, I asked, "Why do you do what you do? You're such a unique actor, and you're a little bit extreme on camera." Jim said, "I act that way because I want to give the people who are watching permission to be themselves." The biggest travesty in the world is people preventing and limiting themselves from expressing who they really are because they're afraid of what other people think. This sentiment comes close to a religion for Jim. He calls it freeing people from concern. He elaborated on this during a commencement address at Maharishi International University. "The purpose of my life had always been to free people from concern. How will you serve the world? What do they need that your talent can provide? That's all you have to figure out. The effect you have on others is the most valuable currency there is. Everything you gain in life will rot and fall apart, and all that will be left of you is what was in your heart." The fastest learners on the planet are children, and that's partly because they don't care what others think of them. They have no shame about failing. They will fall 300 times and get up 300 times in the course of learning how to walk, and they don't feel embarrassed. They just know they want to walk. As we get older, we have a harder time staying this open. We might take a singing lesson or maybe a coding class, and if we hit a flat note or make a mistake as we learn, we shrink or stop. Part of being limitless is learning to let go of the fear of criticism from other people. History is littered with examples of those who overcame the negative opinions of the people around them. The Wright brothers accomplished their incredible feat of making a machine fly through the air and initially received virtually no acclaim for it. When they returned home from their inaugural flight on December 17, 1903, they were not met with brass bands and cigars and streamers. They were met with doubt. Their biographer, Fred Kelly, wrote that the neighbors had a hard time believing what had happened. Said one, "I know you boys are truthful, and if you say you flew through the air in the machine, I believe you. But then, down there on the Carolina coast, you had special conditions to help you. Of course, you couldn't do it anywhere else." Hardly the enthusiastic response one would expect, right? The papers and media didn't report on their accomplishment either. According to Kelly, noted scientists of the time had already explained why man couldn't fly, so no newspaper reporter was willing to report on the story for fear of being humiliated. No editor wanted to print a story that directly refuted a respected scientist's proclamations that flying was not scientifically possible. The lack of public recognition didn't faze the Wright brothers. They knew they had more work to do and set about perfecting their flying machine, which eventually did earn the recognition that it deserved. Most of us fear the opinions of others when we simply think about trying something new. What the Wrights' stories show is that public imagination is woefully underwhelming, and people have a hard time reconciling what they believe is possible with what is actually happening. Here's the truth. Creating the life you want can be scary. But you know what's scarier? Regret. One day we will take our final breaths, and not one of other people's opinions or your fears will matter. What will matter is how we lived. Don't take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from. People will doubt you and criticize you no matter what you do. You will never know your true potential until you break the unfair judgments you place on yourself. Don't allow other people's opinions and expectations of you to run or ruin your life. New belief. It's not your job to like, love, or respect me. It's mine. Lie number 7. Genius is born. Bruce Lee is known today as a film star, philosopher, and one of the most accomplished martial arts fighters in the history of the sport. And yet, given his background, you wouldn't have pegged him as a future icon if you were under the assumption that genius is born. Lee's family moved from San Francisco to Hong Kong shortly after he was born. Not long after they arrived, Hong Kong was occupied by Japan, making it a politically and socially tumultuous place to grow up. As a young man, Lee was faced with the difficulty of being the ultimate outsider. He was not purely Chinese, so the students in his classes made fun of him. He also wasn't British like the other kids in his private school, so he was frequently taunted for being Oriental. The feeling of tension was ever present for him, so he turned to fighting to battle his way through. Fighting began to define him. His grades were low, and he fought so often in school that he transferred to a different primary school. When Lee was 13, he met his teacher, Yip Man, who taught him Wing Chun. He was accepted into this famous teacher's school and began to learn the style of Kung Fu. Not unlike the rest of his education, he was still taunted by the Chinese children who felt he was not enough like them to be allowed to learn the technique. He constantly had to prove himself and his abilities, and his fighting spilled over into the streets. The internal tension, coupled with Hong Kong's slide into gang violence, led to Lee fighting far more often than learning. He developed a reputation for being street tough through his willingness and propensity for battle. After one particularly bad street fight, a high-ranking police officer approached Lee's parents and told them their son would be arrested. The boy had beat up the night before was the son of this police officer. Lee's father quickly arranged for Lee to go back to America. After all, he still had citizenship. So, off Lee went with $100 in his pocket. Like most Chinese kids who had gotten off the boat, my first job was washing and bussing dishes, said Lee in a later interview. He worked to support himself with odd jobs and eventually started teaching martial arts. Lee wasn't just talented, he was also willing to teach other people, and he accepted everyone who came to him as a student, regardless of their race or background. This soon ruffled the feathers of the Chinese community in Oakland, who felt that these techniques should not be taught to anyone who wasn't Chinese. Eventually, he was forced to defend his right to teach. The Chinese traditionalists challenged him to a fight, saying that if he won, he could keep his school. But if he lost, he would be forced to shut it down and stop teaching to people outside of their ethnic group. Lee's style was different than any other form of martial arts. When he was still living in Hong Kong, he took dancing lessons, and in 1957, he was so good he won the Cha-Cha Championship. He added the movements he learned in dance to his fighting techniques. Where other fighters took a mostly solitary stance with their feet, he kept moving constantly, which fueled his ability to adapt to his opponent's moves. Lee did this with everything he learned later in life. Eventually, his style incorporated not only Wing Chun, but boxing, fencing, and dancing. It was a major turning point, the old vanguard against the new. Lee's wife, Linda, was 8 months pregnant at the time, and she remembers the scene vividly, almost comically. She recalls it took 3 minutes for Lee to get his opponent down to the ground. Before this takedown, the opponent had to run around the room trying to get away from Lee. After the fight, Linda found Lee with his head in his hands, despite his victory. He told her that his trainings didn't prepare him for this kind of battle. As she describes it, this was the beginning of the evolution to his own way of martial arts. After this battle, Lee no longer tried to fit his knowledge and teaching into one box and discarded most of his original training. He openly took influences from other areas of fighting outside of Wing Chun and Kung Fu, using them to form a philosophy of martial arts. In a later interview, he said, "I do not believe in styles anymore. I do not believe there is such a thing as the Chinese way of fighting, Japanese way of fighting." Instead, Lee's approach focused on fighting as a way of ultimate self-expression. When people come to me to learn, they're not coming to me to learn to defend themselves. They want to learn to express themselves through movement, anger, and determination. He believed that the individual is more important than any style or system. No one remembers Lee for his academic endeavors. Lee is remembered for his tenacity, his ability to defeat his opponents, his philosophy, and for the way he managed to break out of the box of orthodox thinking and bring different styles of fighting together to create an entirely new philosophy. So was he a natural genius, someone born to achieve outsized physical, mental, and philosophical feats? In The Talent Code, author Daniel Coyle delves into whether talent is innate or whether it can be developed. He argues greatness isn't born, it's grown. Through deep practice, ignition, and master coaching, anyone can develop a talent so deep it looks like genius. Bruce Lee's daughter, Shannon, spoke at our annual conference about her father's approach to memory and learning. She said that by the time Lee was a film star and notable teacher, he had already achieved thousands upon thousands of hours of deep practice, at least in part because of his early days in fighting on the streets. Later in life, Lee didn't master the famous one-inch punch in a day. That alone took years of hard repetition and practice. Lee continued to train and condition himself even with a back injury. It was a daily commitment. Ignition is the motivation, the fuel to do what you do. It seems Lee's initial fuel was the tension he felt as a Chinese American in a place that didn't accept him as either. Later, his ignition seems to have been his drive for ultimate self-expression. And finally, Lee had training from a master teacher, Yip Man, who himself was trained by several master teachers from the time he was a child. When Lee became his student, he had been teaching Kung Fu for decades. Lee's talent was born of a confluence of experiences and circumstances that served him well, although they may have defeated someone else. How many of us would look at a young child with a propensity for fighting and poor grades and predict that he would become a master teacher and philosopher? Here's the truth. Genius leaves clues. There is always a method behind what looks like magic. New belief. Genius is not born, It's made through deep practice. Quick start. How many of the lies described here did you believe in before listening and reading this book? Are there any other ones you would add? Write them now in your notepad. Before we move on, understanding that these commonly held limiting beliefs are nothing more than myths is an essential part of becoming limitless. When you convince yourself that any of these are true, you're giving yourself an unnecessary burden to carry around. While these 7 are among the most common, keep your radar up for any conventional wisdom that has the effect of putting constraints on your potential, and examine that wisdom very carefully. In most cases, you're going to find that such constraints don't apply to anyone willing to push beyond them. Before going to the next chapter, give these things a try. Take a good look at some of the mistakes you've made. Have you let these define you? How have your feelings about these mistakes changed after reading this chapter? Find a way to put something you've recently learned, even today, into action. Notice the difference it makes when you turn knowledge into power. Think about a situation where you allowed the opinions of others to sway your actions. How would you approach the same situation differently if the only opinion that mattered was yours? And finally, I want to gift you my 4 G's to a limitless mindset, including more strategies for replacing limiting beliefs. You could get that at limitlessbook.com/resources.